All right, why don't we start? More people may show up. So welcome all for coming. Thank you for coming to our little virtual fire chat. It's my pleasure to introduce Tom Bukowski, also known as Tom Belstorff, who is, I think, anthropologist royal of virtual worlds. My name is George Jagowski. I'm a professor at Caltech, and my interests are really in how's computing and information technology changing the world. Science, scholarship, education, but pretty much everything else. So the plan here is we will each spend about 10 minutes outlining what are the key ideas we want to convey, and then we will open the stage for your questions. So as far as questions are concerned, well, first, please wait until we're done, and then use text just to avoid the usual confusion with voice. And precede your question with question in capital letters, kind of like this. So without further ado, I'll yield over to Tom.
Oh, right. You're having me start. Hello. Can everyone hear me okay? Happy Sunday, wherever you are. Hopefully I'm sounding good. Oh, thanks, Rayla. Yes, for letting me know. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here. It's always so much fun to chat with people, and it's extra fun for me right now because I'm just beginning a new project about the metaverse and climate change, and I actually, by tomorrow or Tuesday, probably tomorrow, there's going to be a 3-minute trailer that Drax has done that is amazing for my new research project. And so I'm really excited about that. It's really fun to be at a new place of research where you're really thinking about questions more than answers. And we've got lots of questions. And questions are important because one thing I've learned after being in this area for 20 years now is how you start really matters. Your initial concepts really matter. That's why those of you who know me know I'm always talking about how it's really confusing to talk about Second Life versus the real world because things here can be real. And in the physical world, not everything is real either because you can have Halloween or Hollywood or whatever, that kind of thing. So with regard to this metaverse, we're in a very, to me, interesting time because we're at the bottom of a hype cycle, right? Now everything is about AI, and AI will impact the metaverse. I can talk about that. But for me, as sort of a beginning, I just want to mention sort of 4 confusions that happen with this idea of the metaverse. And what it's really about is when people say that something that is optional for the metaverse is something that is required for the metaverse. And when they do that, it's usually because they're trying to sell you something. So here I'm just going to put in the chat 2 really wonderful, smart people or groups of scholars who try and give a definition of the metaverse. And you've seen this kind of thing before, where it's sort of a grab bag of lots of different things, right? Mixing up all of these different things. And what we see happening are sort of 4 main confusions. And I was just going to sort of mention those. So the first one has to do with virtual reality, or VR. And these are just some, notes that I've done from when I've given talks on this in the past, and it was just too hard to put together slides for today. So I'm just going to put this in the text, and I don't know how the formatting will work, just for your convenience, and then I'll just sort of talk off of it. So virtual reality, when that term was invented by Jaron Laney and other people, it's really unfortunate. It's a very confusing idea to talk about an interface like a Meta Quest or a Vision Pro as reality. It's very ableist because people who are have vision impairments or blind have a life just as real as the rest of us, right? And it's confusing sensory immersion with, we have social immersion right now here in a virtual place. What the metaverse is at its foundation is about virtual worlds, right? And that can be done through a VR interface, or what I call SI, sensory immersion. That's really cool. But you can also do it in 2D with a screen, like most of us probably are right now, or even in 1D. Many virtual worlds, especially early on, like MUDs, if you know what those are, were done through text. And the spatial computing term that Apple is using, that actually originates with the company Magic Leap, is actually not a bad term in some ways, because this is about space and place. But the confusion is they're trying to sell their new device, the Vision Pro, right? What we're doing right now is spatial computing. We're sitting at Vertex in a virtual space, and what we're doing right now is spatial computing. So what's going to happen is that moving forward with the metaverse, some of it will involve 3D kinds of goggles, right? Sensory immersion kinds of things, but not always and not all the time. Even if you look at things like VR chat or virtual worlds that are very emphasizing sensory immersion, they almost always have a 2D mode, right? And they always do, actually. So that's the first confusion. The second confusion is interoperability. This idea, and you see that in the quotes, that somehow everything has to be interoperable. Oops, that didn't come. Wait, that did not. That was the wrong. I repeated the old one. Here we go. Sorry. There we go. So people saying that the metaverse has to be interoperable. That I need to take this Tom Bukowski avatar and be able to use it in Roblox or Horizons or Fortnite or whatever, that this is going to be the goal. But as an anthropologist, and I'm thinking about the relationship between culture and technology, there's no inevitable reason that has to be the case, and there's actually lots of reasons that we might want to keep identities distinct. We do that normally in the physical world. I'm a professor, and when I go home, I'm not the same person in some ways, right? I have a different social network. I have a different email. And in many ways, a lot of the people pushing this idea of interoperability are really talking about surveillance and advertising and wanting to be able to track people, to be honest. There's no technical reason for that. And there will be forms of connection. And if you know, there's a really cool group, the Metaverse Standards Forum, that's working on sort of equivalents for PDF or JPEG for 3D objects that would work across an even bigger range of virtual worlds than the kinds of things we have right now. But there's going to be important kinds of separation as well. The metaverse doesn't require that interoperability. And for me as an anthropologist, there's going to be interesting shared ways of thinking and practices that will show up between virtual worlds and the metaverse. Maybe not all of them, of course, but that's different than a standard like JPEG or something. So, for instance, the idea of friending someone, or the idea of going away from keyboard, or even something like copying and pasting, those may not be shared technical standards. They might be shared cultural beliefs and practices, and that's going to be a really interesting thing to look at. A third confusion about the metaverse is that it has to be massive, or it has to be big. And this is a real case where you see the influence of the technology hype world. What's the next iPhone? What's going to be the big thing, right? We have to have something really, really big or go home. It's amazing how many people ask me, is Second Life still around, right? Because it only has 500,000 people. Well, anthropologists study cultures much smaller than that for decades and learn amazing things. We don't all live in India or China. Lots of culture and everyday interactions are with much smaller groups. So I've actually talked about scaling a metaverse of hundreds. There is no reason why things have to be massive. And all of this energy, for instance, some of you may have seen with trying to be able to have, 10,000 avatars in one room, like a space like this. But as an anthropologist, how often do people actually interact that way, right? That's once again this sort of, in some ways, it's an influence of tech hype. So, the metaverse is going to be very multifaceted, and there may be contexts or cases where we have sort of massive scaling, but not always, right? There's going to be sharding, and there's going to be all other kinds of things like that. And then a fourth confusion is crypto, that the metaverse will be based or have blockchain and NFTs, that kind of thing. And this is just such an obvious example of people trying to find a killer app for crypto. And if you know about things like Decentraland, there are metaverses out there, virtual worlds, I mean, that are being designed to require or be friendly to NFTs. And once again, all four of these confusions are about things that will be there sometimes, right? But are not definitionally necessary to something being part of the metaverse. And so with this example, there might be cases where, Bitcoin or using blockchain technology to track digital objects, for instance, could be something useful. But the idea that it is necessary, which you do see in some of these definitions of the metaverse, is, to be blunt, people trying to find a killer app for crypto. There's going to be plenty of cases of virtual worlds that use physical world currencies like the dollar or interchangeable currencies like the Linden dollar here in Second Life. And there's no technical reason why virtual worlds have to be built on capitalism at all. So once again, I'm not saying this won't be there, but these are ways that it could be there. And so just to sort of in closing, I had mentioned, like with AI is another example where two big areas that we're going to see AI show up are non-player characters, and you've seen some attempts of that recently in Second Life. Also sort of assistance, like I'm doing some research right now in WolfGrid, which has Bobby, right, which is an AI agent that isn't a chat bot, but a helper, like it will code in LSL and do other kinds of things for you. And then another area, if you've heard of Holodeck, or there's a new initiative from Google, I think it's the Genie initiative, where you can, instead of Chat GPT or Dolly that generate images or even video, that there are already being tested some AI agents where you could say, make me a medieval village with 10 huts and a river running through it and trees. And it would generate a 3D environment, which you could then modify and perfect, or, whatever, but that it could assist you with sort of 3D building. That's going to be another area where we're definitely going to be seeing some really interesting applications coming from AI. But when people ask me, hey, Tom, you only have one sentence, how are you going to define virtual worlds? And if I do, or sorry, how are you going to define the metaverse? And if someone asks me, you've only got one sentence, you've only got 5 words, how are you going to define it? Here is my 5 words. The one thing that you have to have for the metaverse is virtual place. If you're just emailing or messaging someone and nothing else, most folks are not going to think of that as the metaverse. And everything else really sort of comes from that, this amazing potential to create online persistent places. And these new technologies and emerging things, from AI to crypto to VR, have a lot of exciting potential, but they are not the metaverse themselves. They're going to be part of this constellation of things, but they are not necessary for it. And what will be really interesting will be to see how these things unfold moving forward. So I will stop there, and thank you.
Well, thank you, Tom. This was great introduction. And I would like to offer a slightly different path to it, which is really, what is the metaverse really for, and therefore how it comes to be. And sometimes people who are not really familiar with the subject ascribe everything to Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash, but there are many people before him. A lot of computer scientists have worked on this kind of stuff. In particular, there is a book called Mirror Worlds by David Gellartner, and that was from '93. He pretty much envisioned something like metaverse or virtual worlds to span the whole physical world, and also things like digital twins and so on. Oh, by the way, he was also one of the victims of the Unabomber, but survived. And then there's a number of cyberpunk science fiction writers. I think original ideas from Werner Vinge, and then others like William Gibson and what's his name? Doesn't matter. Anyhow, with Neil Stephenson and others after them. So the idea is not new. Um, and aside from the social aspects, which is really what Tom was addressing, I would like to talk about what other things there are. Now, some of you probably know about the great philosopher of science, Karl Popper. And he also wrote about science, about society. He coined the term open society and so on. But he was a philosopher, epistemologist, and he came up with the concept of what he called World 3. And this was as he was looking at so-called mind-body problem, which is something philosophers like to worry about, and most people don't. How is subjective mind really interacting with physical world and where it comes from? Popper noted that this is not a two-body problem, it's a three-body problem. So there is a world of informational constructs that people have created in our culture. Books, stories, music, paintings, anything like that. And that world exists independently of any given mind. Beethoven's Ninth Symphony exists in that sense, even if you don't hear it at a given time if nobody's playing it. So that I thought was a very visionary thing. And then as information technology progressed, we started having things like virtual worlds, which serve social interaction purposes that Tom has described. And it's useful to ask, what is the metaverse supposed to be for? And indeed, it's supposed to be universal, open, persistent, shared virtual space, etc., in which humans can interact with each other. They also interact with information constructs of any kind and can control processes in the physical world. This is pretty much what science fiction authors have envisioned as well. But what it's not a game. You can play games in virtual worlds, but it's not a game, or it's not a collection of games. It can be used for that as well as other things. And even virtual worlds, as they exist today, are not little metaverses. I would call them meta-villages more than anything. The universe is a lot bigger than that. And they'll play the role in developing whatever metaverse turns out to be. But if you think about functionality, what people are doing in this cyberspace, well, that's exactly like the web and internet today, except with three-dimensional graphics and sense of immersion and so on and so forth. That metaverse does not exist yet. Technology is not there yet, but it will in due time. And so my main thesis here is that the web is really the metaverse today, with one-dimensional and two-dimensional content like speech or text or music are one-dimensional, images and videos are two-dimensional. And then, as technology gets better, we'll be able to render things in 3D in a way that's more intuitively appealing and more truthful. But the important point here is that all of the human information today is on the internet or somewhere on the web. And that's where it's going to stay. And essentially all human activities that involve brain sometimes are happening in this shared cyberspace of the web and the internet, including work, including education, entertainment, learning, everything. And so that's where they will stay. There's not going to be some kind of new three-dimensional web built from scratch to host whatever people imagine it. It will basically be the next evolutionary stage of the current metaverse, the web. And it has to be download compatible. You should be able to see all of the 2D content. Not everybody will be able to use 3D interfaces. And it has to be free and open and not really ruled by any given company, whether it's Meta or Microsoft or Apple or whoever. The reason why web succeeded so phenomenally and was one of the most transformative technologies ever is that it was free and open. There is the World Wide Web Consortium that agrees on the standards, and then anybody can build their own websites and do whatever they want. This is why the web has grown as much as it has. So that pretty much has to be the case for the next stage. And whatever Zuckerberg is dreaming of, his company will not own it all. And there's not going to be more than one of these, say, Meta's Metaverse, Microsoft's Metaverse, and whatever, because that kind of defies the whole purpose. Right? It has to be easily shareable content. Well, otherwise, why would you put it? Now, that's not to say there won't be little closed gardens like current games or virtual worlds are. There are purposes for that too. But there's an overspanning of tissue that connects all of the cyberspace and all of the human information products ever. That's basically going to be outgrowth of the current web and internet. Okay, so I'll stop there, and I think we will open for questions. And let me remind you, preface your question with question in capital letters so we can recognize what's question versus just general chat. Well, the first question was really from Chilo, and I think Tom is in a good position to answer that one.
Okay, let me pull up my chat window here, and I can even try and just do a quick thing on. So virtual worlds do change the idea and concept of place very much. And, for me as an anthropologist, I always try to be clear about saying what is and what ought to be, right? What we say a descriptive or prescriptive claim. And we can do both, but sort of, looking at what is happening and what we think might should be. That from the very beginnings of virtual worlds, and as like George was saying, these go back, Lambda Mu and Ubermud and some of these go back 30 years, right? People have often created private, public, different social uses of place. And even beyond private and public could mean a work environment, or it could mean shopping, or it could mean education. And so there's very few virtual worlds, I would hazard a guess, probably none, that have undifferentiated space. If they have any degree of size, then they start to get differentiation. Now, of course, one important thing to obviously think about with regard to virtual worlds is some of them are much more company controlled than others. So ones that are, designed mostly as games might not have the ability for you to make a home space, although some of them do. But in terms of how they can be done, they absolutely change the idea and concept of place. And just very quickly, two ways they do that are scarcity and proximity. So physical world place is very much shaped by proximity and value and meaning created by how close or far something is. Proximity remains important in virtual worlds, but it works differently when you can teleport, right? So proximity still matters. Like right now, there is meaning in the fact that we're not all 400 meters from each other inside of Second Life, but we can also teleport. And those of you old enough to remember telehubs was an interesting way that Second Life tried to create proximity in a particular way, which other virtual worlds have done as well. And even the ability, let's say, for an avatar to fly or move quickly and teleport, these have impact. So like in Roblox, you can't teleport inside of most Roblox experiences. And so you have to move. It takes a long time to get around a big space in Roblox. So there's a different meaning of place. And then the second one I mentioned was scarcity, that you can make more land in a virtual world. There is a cost, there's a server, there's energy, but you can do it in a way that you can't in the physical world, where as long as we're on planet Earth, there's a limited amount of space. And in this regard, it's very interesting, and I've written about this, the way that time works differently than place in terms of this influence of virtual worlds, because there's no technology that's going to exist where I could be in California at, 11:28 in the morning, and you could be in Tokyo at 11:28 in the morning, and we're on at the same time, right? Time resists getting virtualized in a way that place does not. And so that is a very interesting, piece. And then very quickly, and then George can chime in about that massive kind of thing. We don't necessarily move away from history, but history doesn't determine us. And George made a very important point, how virtual worlds are not games, right? As Richard Bartle, who's a very famous early designer of virtual worlds, talks about, a football stadium is not a game. You can play a game in it, but it's not. And the reason for this confusion is understandable. All of the largest virtual worlds to date are very game oriented, right? Even things like Roblox and Minecraft are pretty game oriented. So the confusion is understandable. And so, but even the early virtual worlds like World of Warcraft, people were getting married and were doing non game things in them. And so I can't predict about being considered a success or not, or why that, who would determine that. But there are, it will become increasingly clear, and it has to people, that the metaverse isn't only for games, although games are very important. And when you see something as boring as Mark Zuckerberg's attempt to create offices in Horizon Worlds, you can see why people still think of them in terms of games. But anyway, I will leave it at that, and George can chime in, and then I'll scroll through and look at some of the other questions. Thank you.
Yes, very good. So my wrinkle on this is, well, I think question was how will people in the future regard Second Life and various other virtual worldish things now or from the past. I think they're all interesting experiments, seeds of something to come, but I don't think that any one of them will evolve into what we really would like Metaverse to be, essentially. World Wide Web with the 3D content and immersion. And personally, I don't think that Second Life is going to last very much longer. Actually, I've been kind of waiting for it to die for the last 10 or 12 years, thanks to the poor management by the Linden Labs. And yet, here we are. And it's still one of the best, if not the best, example of virtual worlds. So I would say some of these things, including Second Life, will be remembered as, well, precursors, but we have ways to go. And I can't imagine what it's going to be like aside from, well, web with 3D content and 3D interfaces. So let's see. A question from Slack. Why is MetaQuest Horizon World so bad? Well, there are technical reasons for this and dumb management decisions. Technical reason is that rendering high-quality avatars, like you see around here, is extremely graphics intensive, computational intensive, it requires high bandwidth and so on. This is why they don't have lower half of the body, because there is less to render. And why do they look like children? Well, I think that's just a bad management decision. In fact, the vast majority of virtual worlds or such things today, people look like juvenile cartoons. I don't know how many real people want to look like juvenile cartoons. So that's my 2 cents worth. You want to take it?
Yeah, you and the people in the chat just answered it very well. It's about a design decision where you want to be able to download faster and where you're not shooting for that graphics fidelity. You don't even have legs. Also, because you want it to be usable with VR. And so, yeah, these design trade-offs that people make. I mean, one reason they got rid of telehubs in Second Life was because it was slowing things down when everyone was starting in one area. And so, and the point there is that the way things are designed, who owns them, really matters. And if in something I've been talking about recently is that, older people like me, in the 1990s and or 80s, the early days of the internet, it was very military, government, and university dominant, and companies couldn't really figure out how to make money and weren't big players, right? They were late to the game in that sense. And now we're in the year 2024. And when we're thinking about the future of the metaverse, we could be talking about it right now in an alternative world where 25% of this kind of metaverse virtual worlds VR stuff was corporate owned and 75% was nonprofit or community or open source education owned. We could be in in an alternative world where 50% was nonprofit and 50% corporate, or an alternative world where it was 75% corporate and 25% nonprofit. We're in a world where it's 99.5% corporate. And the nonprofit world, I mean, I'm making up that number, but you know what I'm saying. One reason I'm finding WolfGrid so interesting is that it's not corporate owned. It's part of an open source initiative and sort of a mom and pop business model, so to speak. And I just think we cannot underestimate the degree to which a tech corporate mindset shapes a lot of conversations about what the metaverse is and should be. There's a real lack of diversity around ownership. And so I think, like I said, the things around advertising and surveillance and interoperability, those would be very different conversations if it was not so corporate dominant. And so it's our job to think of futures that are not only limited by those players, the people who are the dominant people who own these virtual worlds, because that wonderful example of Horizon Worlds, or even something like Minecraft or Roblox, there's a design decision to have a virtual world that doesn't have detailed avatars, and then you don't have the same amount of lag. It's easier for it to work on mobile devices. It has all kinds of benefits that come from doing that. Or if you have a virtual world that's very game oriented, a kind of League of Legends or Fortnite kind of thing, where most of the data is server side because you can't make your own textures, you can't build your own places. And so on your computer, what's called the client side is actually a thin client. There's not much there. So you get much faster loading time. You have a big download at the beginning, and then things can be much faster because you're not, having as much information on individual computers. There's a cost in terms of creativity and customizability, but there are also advantages. And these are social decisions, but we live in a world with their corporate decisions, and there's pushback from the community and players, but it is not an even playing field. And I think moving forward, it's really important to think outside the box in that regard.
Very good. So I think Cassie's question is also a good segue, but let me toss in my two Linden work. Use case for crypto. Well, cryptocurrencies, by and large, I would say, most of them are a scam, and all of NFTs are a scam. So that community has been grasping to Metaverse as a use case for them. But there are fundamental problems with that technology and the way it's implemented. So it really goes into the question of intellectual property rights and privacy protections and so on. But Tom, off to you.
I'm just catching up with the chat, but you probably have better answers than me about sort of use cases. Like in theory, for some kinds of commerce, maybe there's a use case, or NFTs that create scarcity. I mean, in some ways, what a non-fungible token does is similar to a very old thing in Second Life, where you make something no copy, no transfer. And, fashion designers will make a dress that is one of a kind. It can't be copied or transferred, and it's a one-time item. No one else is going to be wearing it, and that increases the value. In some ways, that's the basic principle behind the non-fungible token thing, right? A blockchain technology could be used to help track the origins of an object across the metaverse, which could be valuable for ownership and royalties and things like that. So there are some of these possibilities that could happen. Two very quick things just to mention. I saw up there. In terms of the world we live in, a great point someone just mentioned is so much of the metaverse is oriented towards younger people, towards kids, particularly if you think of things like Roblox and Minecraft, where there's a lot more chaperoning and control. So like in Roblox, with the basic settings, if you type the word Discord or a URL or an email address, it just shows up as hashtags, right? And so the way in which we think about adulthood and childhood is really interesting with regard to the metaverse. And then Ilsa had a great point about like I find the whole idea that we need separate things a bit odd. I use my same avatar for everything. And I'm actually like that too, as well, Ilsa. And for me as an anthropologist, this is once again the basic cultural thing of there's a lot of diversity out there. And there's people who really want to keep things separate, and there's people who don't. And it could change over time. Maybe in a year or two, someone might have a different need. And so, as an anthropologist, I think it's really valuable to look at the diversity out there. And there are people who want to have the same avatar for everything, or people who want to have multiple identities, but not for the reasons you think, right? And Second Life is a great example of that. So, for instance, there are people in Second Life who have an alt, but it's a building alt. It's because they're building, they're concentrating, and they don't want to get the IMs from all their friends while they're building. And it doesn't mean that they're antisocial, it just means they're trying to get some building done. Or people who will have a banking alt. They have a small business and they will have an alt that, takes the money basically. Or I know people who have, do fashion design that they'll have an alt that basically is a mannequin, right? They'll use it to try out the clothes and it's just easier for them to have that alt. Someone might think, oh, they have the second identity without understanding the reason that it's there, right? So, Ilsa's point, I just wanted to comment on that because there is such a slippage often between what is and what should be, where people will say, this is what should be, as if it's the only possibility, when in fact, just like there's a lot of cultures around the world and there's cultural diversity even in one village or one town, there's not usually going to be a single answer to any of these questions. And that's great. The danger is right now around corporate control trying to force certain things. So historically, as many of you know, Facebook was a great example of this, where they were really resisting people having multiple accounts. They wanted you to have one consistent identity, which they now, want people to keep. And there were women who had second Facebook accounts because they had a stalker or an ex-boyfriend, and they wanted to be able to communicate with friends and not have that person know. And they were being forbidden from doing that, or from having a Facebook account with their Second Life avatar. So there is that issue of corporate control, but otherwise, for me, what's interesting as an anthropologist is what is the diversity out there? Because you're absolutely right, Ilsa. We don't want to slip into saying that it's somehow human nature that we need separate things for separate people. That's not true. There are people who have one avatar they use for everything, and that's interesting. So that's just a very valuable point, and I really appreciate you making it.
Right, and this is pretty much how people use the web today. You have different accounts and you may have different usernames and so on. But let me start from the question from Gaia. What's the future in terms of how is 3D going to be represented? Holographic avatars or better VR and so on? Yes, all of that. That technology is being developed. I don't think that the headsets like we have now, which are very clunky and you can't wear them forever, and they don't have a good field of view, etc., that that's going to be the solution. Unfortunately, headsets are currently the only way we know how to render 3D content, either overlaid on physical world, as in AR, or fully generated immersive scene like this. But people trying to come up with different kinds of holographic display technologies, which is not an easy thing to do. So I don't know what it's going to look like, but I suspect that just like now, we spend a lot of time on the web. That will make it much easier because you can render this virtual human in some virtual space without having to worry about how will it fit like AR in the real space. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but we got ways to go before we can have a truly science fiction-y holographic avatars in real physical 3D space.
And one quick thing I'll add to that is I'm really bad about predicting the future and don't know that technical side as well as George. But one thing that I do feel safe predicting is that the technology will layer. In other words, there will be interesting new technologies for three-dimensional immersion beyond the goggle model, right, which we currently have. But that screens will not go away and they will take on interesting new forms because if you look at the history of technology, the only historical technology in this kind of communication space that has really gone away is the telegraph. Not that many people know Morse code, but going back almost as far as the telegraph is the radio and the telephone and then television. And they're all still around. Now, Apple TV is very different from an old television, and radio nowadays there is regular radio is still around, but there's also Sirius XM and internet radio. And, so these things remain, but they layer and they change over time. And it is possible for things to go away completely. And the telegraph is a really interesting example of that where the telegraph is basically gone, although there are people who still do it. There's people who still do ham radio. And so I think, in one way or another, we will see things layer. But what the 3D side of it will be really interesting to see. I am not qualified to make any predictions on that, but I'll be watching.
Right. And I would emphasize the same thing, that basically if something works well, people continue using it. We still read paper books and paper magazines and so on and so forth. But let me take a first crack on Dai's second question, or I'm sorry, this is Polaris's question of how do we address the game stigma that really was one of the obstacles in implementing education in Second Life. Well, I think time will solve that problem. It's a generational thing. Digital natives with whom we deal, the students, for them this is like the most normal thing in the world. My kids grew up using Minecraft. And it was a great thing too. So I'll quote Max Planck, who said in slightly different context that science progresses through funerals. So there you have
it. I would just add in the English language we have two words, game and play. In some languages like Indonesian or German, they're not so distinguished, right? Mine is the same thing in Indonesian, but play meaning can be like role playing or playing at things that doesn't necessarily mean a game with rules, right? Where you can win or lose. And there's a whole philosophy of games, and there's really interesting stuff around games. And the anthropologist Gregory Bateson has a wonderful article from 50 years ago about how play is actually something that we share with many animals, right? Dogs and cats play, and that for humans and many animals, play is a place where we learn that symbols are symbols, that you can pretend to hit someone, that you can pretend, kiss someone, and that a symbol isn't the same thing as the thing that it stands for. But for a long time, there has been a stigma attached to games and play as, something that is not real or that is not consequential. And part of that is ideologies around labor and work that assign games and play to the home domain, not as part of labor, which is not true. And we're in a very interesting moment of people talking about things like playbur, where our work and play are intersecting in really interesting ways. And so I very much agree with George that I think science progresses one funeral at a time is the exact quote. Around to not be as morbid, but he's right. But talking about how that stigma towards games, which I see as a professor, people in game studies often have to justify what they do in a very interesting way. Like, I'm not wasting my time studying games when they're such a huge part of the human experience. That stigma against games, which has been around for a long time, it does seem like the incredible prevalence of gaming in our lives right now because of video games and even just solitaire on your phone or whatever is maybe shifting that and people thinking about and the influence of Hollywood as well maybe. It's a really interesting question. How will that stigma continue to play out, and will it go away, or will it shift in ways that it isn't just more or less, but take on a different form? because there has been really important critiques of the idea of gamification, of turning everything into a game. And there's also seems to be value in it as well. So it'll be a very interesting thing to think about and watch. And it's going to be very important because right now, and I'm just making up a number, completely making it up, but we know that the majority of the metaverse is quite game oriented right now. Let's say 90%, 80%, I don't know. But if you look at the biggest virtual worlds, it's very game oriented, and that's going to continue to be a big part of the metaverse. So these questions about game and play are really valuable to think about because if you're interested in the metaverse, because the metaverse is not a game, virtual worlds aren't games, but the biggest pieces of the metaverse out there are very game oriented, and even a more social oriented virtual world like Second Life, as we all know, there's a lot of different games in Second Life. I mean, there's Primtionary. I mean, I grew up playing Tringo in the old days. And so if we're thinking about concepts of the metaverse, which is our topic for today, and the future of the metaverse, games and play are going to be part of that. Absolutely. And what form will that take is going to be really interesting to track.
So let me just amend my comment regarding generational change. In the sense of elderly professors, university administrators, business leaders, and so on, it's really hard to change at the pace of the technology. We're talking now about the technologies that evolve roughly at Moore's law pace, which is orders of magnitude faster than any other technology ever. And it's really hard for people to change it. So you notice in academia that a lot of people pretty much get stuck technologically, whatever was there when they were in grad school. And, you have to really work hard to adapt to new things. But again, things will change as new generations come in. This is an interesting subject in of itself, so let's not go there. And a quick answer to Elsa's other question about online modes of education. Yes, that's a great stuff. I think education industry is long overdue for major upheaval and restructuring. Now, we have solved the problem of content delivery online through YouTube videos, MOOCs, whatever. There is the problem that's partly solved, which is human interaction component of education, like right here and now, but other social media. And then there is a problem of learning hands-on stuff. And so people are trying to come up with virtual versions of teaching labs and such. So I would say things are changing, but academia as an institution has gigantic inertia. The only institutions that are older than academia are the church and the military, and you know how fast they change.
I can answer quick on these a couple things. And just so the audience knows, we will wrap this up in 3 or 4 minutes here because it's almost noon. So don't worry, we're keeping an eye on the time. But two quick points. First of all, around the elderly professor point. But one thing I'm thinking about actually for my future research in the next couple of years is to actually do some degree of focus on older folks. My colleague Celia Pierce did one of the first studies of baby boomer of older gamers, and the research, particularly because of the influence of education research, the research on virtual worlds, online games, more game oriented or social oriented, the research that's out there is very weighted towards young people and youth. There is remarkably little study of 50 and older denizens of the metaverse, and there's a lot, right? And so I think it's actually really important to look because, while it is often challenging for older folks to keep up with and learn new technologies, quite a few of us do and are proficient and active. And in terms of, sort of a research gap to the degree there are people doing work in that space, but it's remarkably few. And so I do think that's important to think about cohorts and the impact of the life course on the metaverse and not extrapolate only from people under 20, basically, which is where there's a huge amount of research. And then very quickly, the mobile app. I've just seen the updates. I don't know anything about that, but I'll just say briefly this relationship between interface and place. What's interesting is that it's going in both directions, and that will be very interesting to watch. In other words, it's going, if you think about the screen, and most of us right now in this room are probably looking at a monitor, at a screen. On the one hand, it's going in the direction of the option, at least, for a Quest or a Vision Pro of the 3D immersive sensory immersion in that direction, but it's also going in the other direction towards small screens and mobile apps and maybe your watch or something like that. And so the relationship between interface and virtual place is broadening. We're going to see more interfaces than only the screen of the computer or the laptop, which is the dominant thing right now. And once again, that I think it's likely that the screen will remain majority or dominant thing, but it'll be interesting to look at socially, people who are involved in businesses or groups in a virtual world. There could be really valuable, aspects from being able to more easily communicate on a mobile device or smart glasses or a phone or whatever, where it's not 3D and it may not even be 2D, or it may be simplified 2D, but it's a different interface. So it is interesting, this multiplicity of devices, which in both directions still isn't really there yet. It's just starting, but it sure seems like those are going to be showing up. And my prediction, to the degree I make predictions, is that neither of those is going to replace, right? It's going to be additive. It's going to be additive. And it'll be really interesting to see what that might mean for social interaction. I mean, one of you has to leave right now and we're talking for 5 more minutes, but you still participate on a mobile device, right? That would be an interesting thing that will become easier to do for sure.
So, somewhat related to that, as I might have said before, that the technology for really comfortable, usable, omnipresent headsets has got ways to go, and real holograms even more so. So, I actually think that virtual worlds, just like this one, will be a kind of gateway into the better 3D web someday. I mean, as we know, virtual worlds like Second Life work better in a subjective sense than they have any right to, because our minds interpolate over all the imperfections of graphics and so on. And I think we'll see more and more acceptance of virtual spaces like Second Life. Second Life itself, hard to say. They're based on a 20-year-old technology with a lot of band-aids on top of it. And they're not using modern game engines, for example. I've been waiting for somebody else to come up with a new improved version of Second Life, but it just hasn't happened. To answer the last question, well, that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do for some purposes, but I was thinking more in general, the general metaverse. Certainly for some type of educational activities, what you described is perfectly good thing to do now. Well, folks, our time has now ended, and thank you all for coming. Maybe we'll do this again sometime. Stay tuned to other things that happen at Vertec. The next Sunday, I'll do a popular astronomy lecture on galaxy formation, but we do have a lot of other stuff that happens now and then. So let me thank Tom for joining us for this, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much. And last question there. I was in Science Space a couple weeks ago, and it is interesting for any technology why some do and don't take off or go viral, and that will be interesting to track. But yes, I thank you so much for inviting me and for having me here. And we can always do follow-up chats in the future. I'll be dropping my Metaverse Ecologies trailer in the next couple days, and I'll be using my Digital Cultures group and staying in touch with Vertex. So thanks everyone, and please do stay in touch. And I really appreciate you all being here today. It was really fun. So thank you so much.